I paid $20 to free a black girl from the sheriff. 5 years later, she walked into my barn and said, "I'm home." The dust never settles in Sweetwater County. That's what I told myself every morning as I watched the red earth swirl outside my kitchen window, carried on winds that seemed to blow from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was 1873, 5 years after the day that changed everything, and I was still trying to make sense of what I'd done. My name is Jacob Morrison, and I run a small ranch about 10 miles outside of Sweetwater proper. It's not much to look at: a modest house, a barn that leans slightly to the left, and enough grazing land for maybe 30 head of cattle on a good year. But it's mine, earned with my own sweat and the small inheritance my father left me when consumption took him in '68. I reckon I should start with that day in September when everything began. I'd ridden into town for supplies, same as I did every month. Sweetwater wasn't much more than a wide spot in the road with pretensions: a general store, a saloon, a church that saw more tumbleweeds than congregants, and Sheriff Hawkins' office. Hawkins was the kind of man who wore his badge like a crown and his prejudices like a Sunday suit. I was loading flour and beans into my wagon when I heard the commotion. A crowd had gathered outside the sheriff's office, and voices were rising in that particular way that meant trouble was brewing. Being the curious fool I've always been, I tied off my horse and wandered over to see what had everyone so riled up. $20, Sheriff Hawkins was saying, his voice carrying that smug tone he used when he thought he was being particularly clever. "That's all it'll take to settle this matter." The crowd had formed a rough circle around a girl who couldn't have been more than 16 years old. She was slight of build but stood straight as a pine, her dark eyes fixed on something in the distance that only she could see. Her dress was torn and dusty, and there were rope burns on her wrists, but what struck me most was the way she held herself, like a bird that knew it could fly if only someone would open the cage. "What's the charge, Sheriff?" asked Tom Bradley, who owned the general store. "Vagrancy," Hawkins said, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "Girl's got no papers, no owner, nowhere to go. Law says I can hold her until someone pays the fine or takes responsibility." I felt my stomach turn. The Civil War had ended 8 years prior, and slavery was supposed to be nothing but a bitter memory. But out here in the territories, the law was often whatever men like Hawkins said it was, and there were still those who found ways to keep the old systems alive in new form. "Seems to me," said a voice I recognized as belonging to Curtis Webb, a rancher who owned half the county. $20 is a fair price for a good worker. I could use another hand." The way Webb looked at the girl made my skin crawl. I'd heard stories about his ranch, about workers who went in but never came out, about conditions that weren't much different from the plantations down south. "I'll take her," I heard myself saying before I even realized I'd opened my mouth. The crowd turned to look at me, and I felt heat rise in my cheeks. Sheriff Hawkins squinted at me like he was trying to figure out if I was drunk or just stupid. "You Morrison?" he laughed, showing teeth stained brown with tobacco. "What you want with a girl like that?" "Same as any man needs help on a ranch," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'll pay the 20. Webb stepped forward, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. "Now hold on there, Morrison. I spoke first." "But I've got money in hand," I said, pulling $20 from my pocket, most of what I'd brought for supplies. "Seems to me that trumps talk." For a moment I thought Webb might draw on me right there in the street. His eyes went hard and his jaw worked like he was chewing on something bitter. But Sheriff Hawkins was already reaching for my money, and the crowd was watching. Webb was many things, but he wasn't stupid enough to shoot a man in broad daylight over $20, especially not with witness. "Your funeral, Morrison," Webb muttered, but he stepped back. Sheriff Hawkins pocketed my money and turned to the girl. "Looks like you belong to Morrison now. You give him any trouble and I'll hunt you down myself." The girl's eyes met mine for the first time, and I saw something flicker there, hope maybe, or just confusion. I couldn't blame her. I was pretty confused myself. "Come on," I said gently. "Let's get you out of here." She followed me to the wagon without a word, and I helped her up onto the seat beside me. The crowd began to disperse, though I could feel their eyes on us as we drove out of town. It wasn't until we were well out of sight of Sweetwater that she finally spoke. "What?" Her voice was soft but clear, like water running over stones. I'd been asking myself the same question. Seemed like the right thing to do, I said finally. She was quiet for a long time after that, and I began to wonder what I'd gotten myself into. I had $20 less than I'd started with. I still needed supplies, and I had a girl, a stranger, sitting beside me who might bolt the first chance she got. Not to mention that Curtis Webb was now my enemy, and that was never a good thing to be in Sweetwater County. "What's your name?" I asked as we turned onto the track that led to my ranch. "Ruby," she said. "Ruby Johnson. I'm Jacob Morrison, but you can call me Jacob. This is my place up ahead." She looked at the modest buildings with something that might have been relief. "It's nice," she said, and I could tell she meant it. I helped her down from the wagon and showed her inside. The house was simple. A main room with a kitchen area, 2 bedrooms, and not much else. But it was clean, and after what she'd been through, I figured clean was probably a luxury. "You can have the back room," I said. "I'll sleep in the front. Are you hungry?" She nodded, and I set about making a simple meal of beans and cornbread. We ate in relative silence, both of us stealing glances at the other when we thought the other wasn't looking. I was trying to figure out what to do with her, and I suspected she was trying to figure out if I was any different from the other men who'd claimed ownership over her life. After dinner I cleared my throat. "Ruby, I want you to understand something. I didn't buy you. I know that's what it looked like back there, but I don't own you. You're free to go wherever you want, whenever you want." She looked at me with those dark eyes, and I saw tears gathering at the corners. "Then why?" she asked again. "Because it was wrong," I said. "What they were doing was wrong, and I had the means to stop it." She nodded slowly, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "My mama used to say there were still good people in the world." I was starting to think she was wrong. Over the next few weeks, Ruby proved herself to be a hard worker and good company. She had a quick mind and a dry sense of humor that reminded me why I'd always preferred the company of animals to most people. She could rope and brand nearly as well as I could, and she had a way with the horses that bordered on magical. But I could see that she was restless. Sometimes I'd catch her staring off toward the horizon with that same distant look she'd had in town. She was polite and grateful, but I knew she was still trying to figure out where she belonged in the world. One morning in early November, I woke to find a cup of coffee waiting for me and a note on the kitchen table. "Jacob, thank you for everything you've done for me. I'll never forget your kindness, but I need to find my own way now. There are people I need to find, places I need to see. I hope you'll understand. Ruby." I sat at that table with the coffee growing cold in my hands, feeling something I hadn't expected. Loneliness. In just a few weeks, Ruby had become more than just help around the ranch. She'd become the closest thing to family I'd had since my father died. But I understood. Freedom meant the right to choose your own path, even if that path led away from the people who cared about you. The years that followed were harder than I'd expected. I managed the ranch alone, the way I had before Ruby came along, but somehow it felt emptier now. I hired hands when I could afford them, but none of them had Ruby's easy competence or her gift for making even the hardest work seem bearable. I heard news of her from time to time. A traveling preacher mentioned seeing a young black woman working as a guide for wagon trains heading west. A cattle buyer spoke of someone matching her description running a boarding house in Denver. The stories were always vague and often contradictory, but they gave me hope that she was alive and making her own way in the world. Curtis Webb, meanwhile, made good on his promise to make my life difficult. He spread rumors about my nigger-loving ways, tried to undercut my cattle prices, and generally made sure I knew I wasn't welcome in polite society. Not that I'd ever been much for polite society anyway. Then came the winter. It was brutal even by Colorado standards, with snow that piled up to the eaves and temperatures that made stepping outside feel like walking into the devil's icebox. I lost half my herd to the cold, and by spring I was wondering if I'd be able to hold on to the ranch at all. I was in the barn that May evening, tending to a mare who was about to foal, when I heard footsteps in the doorway. I figured it was probably Sam Fletcher, who'd been helping me get back on my feet after the hard winter. "Sam, you're just in time," I called without turning around. "I think she's about ready to." "I'm home." The voice stopped me cold. I knew that voice, had heard it in my dreams more nights than I cared to admit. Slowly I turned around. Ruby stood in the doorway, backlit by the setting sun. She was older now, Obviously, the girl who'd left 5 years ago had become a woman. She wore a traveling dress of dark blue wool and her hair was pinned up under a modest hat, but her eyes were the same, dark and deep and knowing. "Ruby," I whispered, hardly daring to believe. She smiled and it was like the sun coming out after a long storm. "Hello, Jacob." I wanted to run to her, to sweep her up in my arms like they did in the novels my mother used to read, but something held me back, maybe respect, maybe uncertainty, maybe just the knowledge that she'd changed in ways I couldn't yet understand. "You look good," I said instead. "Different, but good." "5 years will do that to a person," she said, stepping into the barn. "You look older and tired. It's been a hard winter." I gestured around at the barn, which was admittedly in worse shape than when she'd left. "Hell, it's been hard years." She walked over to where I stood beside the mare, her movements graceful and confident in a way that spoke of hard-won experience. "What happened here?" I told her about the winter, about the lost cattle, about the struggle to keep the ranch going. She listened without interrupting, occasionally reaching out to stroke the mare's neck. "And Webb?" she asked when I finished. "Still making trouble when he can, but he's gotten older and lazier. Mostly he just badmouths me in town these days." Ruby nodded thoughtfully. "I heard about what happened to his ranch." I looked at her in surprise. "What do you mean?" "Fire last month. Burned down his main house and half his outbuilding. They say it started in the kitchen, but," she shrugged, "fires have a way of starting when people treat others poorly." I studied her face, looking for some clue about what she might know or might have done. But Ruby had always been good at keeping her thoughts to herself when she chose to. "Where have you been?" I asked finally. Her smile turned sad. "Everywhere." "Nowhere." "I went west first. All the way to California. Worked in the gold fields, then in San Francisco. After that, Denver, then back east to Chicago and New York. I saw things, Jacob. Beautiful things and terrible things. I learned that the world is bigger and smaller than I thought." "What brought you back?" She was quiet for a long moment, her hand still moving in gentle circles on the mare's neck. "I kept thinking about what you said that first night, about how you didn't own me, how I was free to go wherever I wanted, and I realized that freedom isn't just about being able to leave, it's also about being able to come home." The mare chose that moment to go into active labor, and for the next hour we worked together to help bring her foal into the world. It was like the old days, Ruby anticipating my needs and moving with the kind of easy competence that comes from genuine understanding. When the foal finally arrived, a beautiful filly with her mother's white markings, we stood back covered in sweat and birth fluids and grinning like fools. "She's perfect," Ruby said softly. "Yeah," I agreed, though I wasn't looking at the horse. We walked back to the house as the stars came out, neither of us speaking much. I made coffee while Ruby looked around the main room, noting the changes that 5 years had brought. There weren't many, I'd never been much for decoration, but she seemed to catalog each one. "You kept it exactly the same," she said finally. "Didn't see much point in changing things." She sat down at the kitchen table, the same one where she'd left her note all those years ago. "Jacob, I need to tell you something." My heart sank. Here it came, the explanation of why she'd returned, followed by the revelation that she'd be leaving again. Maybe she needed money, or help with some trouble she'd gotten herself into. Maybe she just wanted to say goodbye properly this time. "I made money while I was away," she said. "Good money. I invested in a shipping company in San Francisco, ran a boarding house in Denver, even tried my hand at mining speculation. I've got enough saved to buy my own place, start my own business, make my own way in the world." "That's wonderful," I said and meant it, even as my heart broke a little more. "But the thing is," she continued, "I've been to all those places, and none of them felt like home. This place though," she gestured around the simple kitchen, "this feels like home. You feel like home." I stared at her, hardly daring to hope I understood what she was saying. "What I'm asking," she said, her voice suddenly uncertain, "is whether you might want a partner, not just someone to help with the ranch, but a real partner, someone to build something with." The words hung in the air between us like a prayer waiting to be answered. Outside, the wind was picking up, carrying with it the scent of rain, and the promise of a storm, but inside everything was still and perfect and balanced on the edge of possibility. "Ruby," I said finally, "I'd like nothing more." She smiled then, the same smile that had lit up the barn earlier, and reached across the table to take my hand. Her fingers were warm and calloused from years of work. Real and solid and here. Then I'm home, she said again. The storm that broke that night was fierce but short-lived, washing the world clean and leaving the air sweet with the smell of rain-soaked earth. We sat up late talking about the years apart, about the things we'd seen and learned and lost. Ruby told me about the shipping company she'd helped run, about the women who'd stayed at her boarding house, about the miners who'd trusted her with their savings and been rewarded for their faith. I told her about the long winters, about the cattle that had died and the ones that had thrived, about the quiet mornings when I'd wondered if I'd made the right choice in staying on the ranch instead of following her into the wider world. Do you regret it, she asked, staying here all these years? I thought about it seriously before answering. No, I said finally. This place needed someone to care for it. And I needed something to care for, but it'll be better now with two of us. What about the town? They weren't exactly welcoming before, and they won't be any more welcoming now. I shrugged. Let them talk. We'll make our own community here. And if they want to be part of it, they're welcome. If not, that's their loss. Ruby squeezed my hand. You know it won't be easy. People like Webb will try to make trouble. Let them try. I'm older now, and meaner, and I've got something worth fighting for. The next morning dawned clear and bright, and we walked out together to check on the new foal. She was standing on wobbly legs beside her mother, nursing hungrily and occasionally lifting her head to look at us with curious eyes. What should we call her? Ruby asked. I thought about it watching the filly's white markings catch the morning light. How about Hope? Ruby smiled. Hope, I like that. We spent the day working together, Ruby falling back into the rhythms of ranch life as if she'd never left. But there were differences now, subtle ones that spoke of her years of experience and independence. She moved with more confidence, spoke with more authority, and when I suggested a way of doing something, she wasn't afraid to propose a better alternative. That evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Ruby brought up something that had been on my mind as well. Jacob, she said, what are we to each other now? It was a fair question, and one I'd been wrestling with all day. The girl who'd left 5 years ago had been someone I'd cared for, protected, worried about. The woman who'd returned was someone I could see myself building a life with, sharing dreams and disappointments and all the small moments that make up a partnership. I don't know, I said honestly. What do you want us to be? She was quiet for a long time, her eyes fixed on the distant mountains. When I was traveling, she said finally, I met a lot of people. Some were kind, some weren't. Some wanted to help me, others wanted to use me. But with you it was different from the start. You never asked for anything from me that I wasn't willing to give. That's what you do for people you care about. Yes, she said, it is. And I do care about you, Jacob, more than I probably should, more than I ever thought I would. I felt my heart start to beat fast. Ruby, let me finish, she said gently. I've been independent for 5 years. I've made my own decisions, earned my own money, chosen my own path. I'm not the same person who needed rescuing in Sweetwater. I know that. Do you? Because if we're going to be partners, real partners, it has to be between equals. Not because you feel sorry for me or responsible for me, but because you want me here for who I am now. I turned to face her fully, wanting her to see the truth in my eyes. Ruby Johnson, you are the strongest, smartest, bravest person I've ever known. You were that girl 5 years ago, and you're even more so now. If you want to stay here, it's not because I saved you from something, it's because you're choosing to save me from a life without you in. The tears that had been threatening all day finally spilled over, and she reached for my hand again. Then yes, she whispered, I want to be your partner, in all things. We were married 3 months later by the traveling preacher who made his rounds through Sweetwater County twice a year. It was a small ceremony, just Ruby and me, Sam Fletcher as witness, and a handful of neighboring ranchers who'd proven themselves to be decent people over the years. Curtis Webb and his supporters were notably absent, but that suited us fine. Sheriff Hawkins, now considerably older and grayer, attended out of what I suspected was morbid curiosity. He kept staring at Ruby as if he couldn't quite believe this was the same girl he'd been ready to sell 5 years earlier. After the ceremony, he approached us with something that might have been respect in his eyes. Mrs. Morrison, he said, tipping his hat, I want you to know that things have changed since, well, since before. The law's the law now, and it applies to everyone equally." Ruby smiled graciously. "Thank you, Sheriff. I'm glad to hear it." As we watched him walk away, Ruby shook her head in amazement. "Did Sheriff Hawkins just apologize to me?" "I think he did. Times are changing, slowly but surely." "About time," she said, and kissed me right there in front of God and everyone. The years that followed were the best of my life. Ruby's business experience and my knowledge of ranching proved to be a powerful combination. We expanded the herd, improved the grazing land, and eventually built a new barn to replace the one that had been leaning since before I could remember. Ruby also started a small business buying and selling horses, using her gift for understanding the animals to match the right horse with the right rider. Word spread, and soon people were coming from 3 counties over to buy horses from the Morrison Ranch. We faced our share of challenges. Of course, there were still those who disapproved of our marriage, who whispered behind our backs or refused to do business with us. But for every person who turned away, there seemed to be 2 more who were willing to judge us by our character and the quality of our work. Webb continued to be a problem for a few years, spreading lies and trying to undercut our business whenever possible. But his influence waned as younger, more progressive men moved into positions of power in the county. When he died in 1882, found in his bed one morning with a look of surprise on his face, few people mourned his passing. Ruby and I never had children of our own, though not for lack of trying, but we found other ways to build a family. We took in youngsters who needed work and guidance, teaching them the skills they'd need to make their own way in the world. Some stayed for a few months, others for years, but all of them left with more hope than they'd arrived with. One of those young people was a boy named Tom, the son of a former slave who died in a mining accident. Tom was angry and suspicious when he first came to us, convinced that every white person was either an enemy or a fool. Ruby took him under her wing, and slowly, patiently, showed him that the world contained more possibilities than he'd imagined. Tom stayed with us for 3 years, learning to read and write along with how to handle cattle and horses. When he left to start his own ranch in the next county, he hugged us both and called us the best parents he'd ever known. There wasn't a dry eye on the porch that day. As I write this, it's been 15 years since Ruby walked back into my barn and said she was home. We're both graying now, moving a little slower than we used to, but the ranch is thriving and our love has only grown stronger with time. Sometimes when I'm working alone in the barn or the fields, I think about that day in Sweetwater, when I paid $20 to free a girl from the sheriff. It was the best money I ever spent, though not for the reasons I might have thought at the time. I thought I was saving Ruby that day, but the truth is, she saved me. She saved me from a life of loneliness, from the kind of bitterness that can consume a man when he has no one to share his joys and sorrows with. She saved me from being just another bachelor rancher growing old and cranky with only his cattle for company. Ruby often says that freedom isn't just about being able to leave, it's also about being able to come home. But I've learned something else over the years. Sometimes home isn't a place at all. Sometimes it's a person, and the family you build together and the life you create from love and hard work, and the simple decision to be kind to one another. The sun is setting now over Sweetwater County, painting the sky in those familiar shades of gold and crimson that I've watched for more years than I care to count. Ruby is beside me on the porch, reading a letter from Tom about his new ranch and his plans to get married next spring. Hope, the filly who was born the night Ruby came home, is now a grandmother herself, with foals of her own grazing in the pasture. $20, that's all it cost to set in motion the chain of events that led to this moment, this life, this happiness. It seems like such a small amount now, but I suppose the most important decisions often are the simplest ones. I paid $20 to free a black girl from the sheriff. 5 years later she walked into my barn and said she was home, and she was right, we both were.